Hey everybody, I am back from vacation and I'm sick, so this is gonna be a B-roll heavy episode of news, but game news, lots of game news. We gotta talk about games. You know, sometimes I actually feel kind of bad for Larian's head, Sven Vinka.
All right.
He'll say something offhandedly that really doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it, and people like myself will take that shit and run with it. Like I'm going to here today on this video about RPG news that we need to talk about. You see, that's exactly what happened with a recent comment he made accepting an award in Malaysia, one of the new studio locations for Larian with their 24-hour development model. More on that in just a second, because it's really cool. The comment he made was about coming back to win another award around 2028 or 2029. Basically, with a new game around that time, putting a time frame on when we can expect at least one of their upcoming 2 RPGs that they're making. Of course, he immediately walked it back and said not to hold Larian to a date, but it does at least seem feasible. That would allow for 4 to 5 years of game development time. But given the scope and size of Larian's games, well, it might be more likely that we'd get closer to an early access version of that, like we did with Baldur's Gate 3. One thing that might actually help with that release schedule though is their 24-hour development cycle. It's essentially how they hand off development functions to different teams around the world on different time zones. They were in Malaysia in part because Larian has a studio in Kuala Lumpur, along with studios in Barcelona, Dublin, Guildford, Quebec, Warsaw, and its original home in Ghent. That puts studios for Larian across 3 different continents and multiple time zones. This is key to their game making strategy, as Vinka puts it in quote, "We make very large games. An easy example to understand is testing the game. Our KL team can give the game to Europe at the end of their workday and then give it to North America, and then they can give it back to KL. And that way we can test Baldur's Gate 3 in a week, whereas usually we would need a month to test it. It doesn't work for every element, but it works for quite a lot of things." One of the other benefits of this is it helps reduce game development crunch. Crunch, if you're unfamiliar, is the period of game development, usually toward big milestones like release, where game developers are pushed to the limit to get things done. Think mandatory overtime. And any reduction in that crunch sounds great to me. For Baldur's Gate 3 fans, a cool little tidbit about Kuala Lumpur, well, that's where the Dark Urge was made, and that's also where the lead scripter of the House of Hope works. One of the best parts of not just Act 3, but the entire game, in my opinion. And I'll forever say that one of the most underrated acting performances of Baldur's Gate 3 is Hope from House of Hope.
Behind you! Skipping across the plains, spinning plates, making deals with dukes and devils. He's a busy man. A busyness man. But not a man at all, of course. The one that rat-a-tatted the chains in place and broke the future.
I know we'll all be anxiously awaiting Larian's next projects and will of course hang on every word, but as Sven Vinka said, don't hold them to that date. That is for content creators like myself and gaming journalists to wildly speculate around, but you can be better. You can be better than us. It's not hard to be better than us. You've got this. But let's talk about some games that are actually more present, some early access titles. The end of September saw 2 really exciting titles enter early access. Well, technically, one of them had been in early access for a while over on Epic, but they're now finally on Steam and they're already making some waves there. Witchfire is a first-person dark fantasy RPG shooter in development from The Astronauts. It is an indie RPG, and it's got a bit of a mix of a couple different games in it. It's not your traditional RPG, but rather seems to combine elements of looter shooters, Souls-like, and roguelike games. In some senses, I get vibes of Vermintide 2, a fantastic game in its own right, but one that's a bit shallow. It's not quite up to par with, say, a game like Hades 2, at least not yet, but there is an underlying story here of an ongoing war between the church and the witches, and I'm very curious to see where this ends up as it winds through early access's journey. This is definitely an indie title, and it also shows that it's an early access title. But we've seen the high end of a game like this with Hades, so it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here, and how it develops and changes. It made some waves with a few splashy trailers over the last few years, but it sounds like their plan to launch on Epic first and then moved to Steam for early access has served them well, as it's receiving some very positive reviews over there, even in its early access state. But I think this review might encompass it fairly evenly. Quote, "So far, so good. It feels like the game has changed hands over time and lacks identity. The maps are beautiful, but mostly empty to explore. It's an arena shooter, but lacks interesting arenas. It's a Souls-like, but lacks the deep horror vibe of Dark Souls when you keep pushing further. Jumping and gameplay has Destiny roots, but besides the dodge function, jumping isn't utilized enough. My main concern is the lack of handcrafted exploration and enough content that isn't just repeated grind loops. I wish devs all the best in figuring out what they want with this game. However, 6 years of development is a long time for an indie game." 6-year development, I don't know if it is a long time for indie development, because indie development takes a long time, but there's some truth here. I jumped in and played a bit of Witchfire, and I did feel like it was missing a little bit of something. I hope that we do get more. I hope we get more story. One of the things that made Hades so great, a game that I have been binging the hell out of, is that it had its story. It felt like it was evolving and growing. It didn't feel like it was just grinding over and over again. It felt like there was things to explore and an RPG-like element to it that I don't know is fully there yet in Witchfire. But hopefully we get something like that. Another title that launched into early access was Greedfall 2, a much more traditional RPG made in the image of Dragon Age Origins. And it also launched at the end of September, but it's had a bit more of a mixed reaction to it. Greedfall 2: The Dying World is a sequel from the action RPG title. It was one of my more highly anticipated titles for this year, but so far reviews have been mixed, with some feeling like it's been a step backwards for the series. And there's a pretty big reason for that. Greedfall 2 overhauled their combat and companions from the first game, going from action RPG to CRPG with real-time with pause combat. Spiders, the developer, talked up the influence of old BioWare CRPGs like Dragon Age Origins in crafting this game. And that seems to be some of the issue with the reviews so far, with many of the negative reviews wanting the action combat of the first game back, not the DAO type CRPG combat. However, positive reviews have talked up the story, the characters, and the world, all while noting that the combat is still a bit rough and in need of refinement. Oh, and that there's a lot of bugs, but that kind of goes with the territory for an early access title. So it is worth noting that yes, it is an early access title, and it does have a long way to go in several aspects, including refining the performance of the game, the crispness of the new combat system, and of course expanding the actual game out. I remain hopeful for this game, but it does show the perils of making a massive change to your combat with any kind of sequel, whether it's changing to more action-oriented like say Dragon Age, or going to more tactical like Greedfall, or hell, Baldur's Gate 3 going to turn-based combat instead of real-time with pause combat. You're always going to upset some of your player base, but it also means that just maybe, it'll work out better for the series in the end. We'll just have to wait and see if that's what happens with Greedfall 2. I look forward to updates on this game as it progresses. That one thing I also wanted to point out before we moved away from it is that prior to this becoming an early access launch, the developers at Spiders threatened to go on strike due to low wages and instability at the studio. Since then, the developers have secured higher wages. Good for them, and I'm glad to see that it was resolved. I'm sure there'll be a lot more RPG news later in this month, so you might get another video on this, like where we even have an announcement of a upcoming Avatar the Airbender video game coming out from Saber Interactive, as well as some news on the KOTOR remake. So we'll just keep an eye out on what's coming out. But in the meantime, if you just want a little bit of relaxation, why don't we talk about some of the games that would be great if we actually got a sci-fi RPG of them? Something you can see in this video right here. Man, I really want a game like the first one.